Okay, we're going to get this launched off, get it launched here. We still have some people trickling in, but we'll get this thing going. First off, I want to thank everybody for attending the webinar. This is our 5th annual Global Tax Market Assessment, and each year I think we get a little more refined. Some of you will notice that we've actually contrasted the prior year to the current year when you review the documents, so keep a look at those trends. That's important to do as well. I'm Tony Santiago. I'm the president of Tax Talent, Tax Search, Tax Force, and Tax Jobs. This morning, the Tax Search team will actually answer your questions surrounding the major top trends in 2019 report that we put out. U.S. tax reform being one of those major trends that are impacting staffing and retention. The consolidation, spinoffs, and mergers and acquisitions is another. The demographics of the aging in-house tax population in tax, the implications from tax technology, and then we'll also touch on the EU voluntary disclosure directives as well. This year, I'm preparing all of our clients, and I will say the same thing to each of you that are attending. It will be a rather challenging year from a staffing and retention perspective. We expect a tremendous amount of activity. We're seeing it already. I do believe this will continue through the year. So this information, I think, will help you guys manage this going forward. Without further delay, I'm going to pass it over to Adam Golden. He's our Director of Executive Search at Tax Search to get this launched. Adam?
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you everyone for joining us. There's a couple of housekeeping things I want to go over before we get started into everything. First off, the focus of the webinar today is going to be covering the U.S. tax trends from our Global Tax Market Assessment. We will be conducting a second webinar where we will bring in our counterparts from BPA that will discuss all of the non-U.S. issues. So if you have any questions pertaining to the regions outside the U.S., hold on to those and be on the lookout for an invite for the other webinar to come in a couple of weeks. We will have a tax search consultant or recruiter that's going to give a brief overview of each section that Tony outlined before. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions regarding that particular topic. I'm going to get started with Peggy Cross, who is a senior recruiter at Tax Search. And Peggy is going to be going over the U.S. tax reform. Peggy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everyone. We know all of you guys are on the front lines of tax reform and know how crazy it has been. So I'm not going to talk about tax reform in that manner this afternoon, but instead I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking to you about the recruitment and the retention aspects. Last year, as reform was rolling out, things became overwhelming, and tax professionals were having to focus on getting the work completed. This caused hiring to be shelved for most companies unless the role was critical. As companies woke up later in the year and started to make up for the lack of hiring during the first part of 2018, they noticed an added element their tax departments were also going to face, and that was an uptick in retirements. We felt those increased needs here at Tax Search as we had a 40% increase in searches while going through our busiest third and fourth quarter ever since our firm began over 30 years ago. Now that we have moved into 2019, I can tell you we do not see a slowdown in sight. We are running at 100% capacity here, and that is very unusual for this time of year. We are seeing the demand in tax operations and tax planning areas with an emphasis on the international side and transfer pricing. These two areas will be very challenging areas to recruit throughout 2019. If you are on this call, I urge you to take inventory of the professionals that you have overseeing your tax operations and planning areas. We know that over 50% of the number twos in tax are over 55 years of age, and most sit in the tax planning or tax operations roles. You will hear more on the demographic issues facing tax in this webinar from Stephanie Gilmartin. If you are in this situation, start planning now, because it will be critical that you start your recruiting efforts early to obtain the needed replacements, unless you already have succession plans in place. I would also tell you to keep your people stimulated and happy so that you do not lose them to another company. there are some secondary areas to pay attention to for recruitment, and those are, we believe, technology and audit will start to pick up later this year. We will now open the session up for questions. Adam, has anyone sent any questions in?
Let me see here. I have one just come in. It says, I'm an international tax person. How do you see tax reform impacting someone like me in the short term and long term?
Good question.
You want to take that one?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So in the short term, I think, there's no worries. You're going to be a busy person. We have not seen the need for international people diminish like we thought we would initially when reform rolled out. What we have seen is the non-U.S. companies start to look for U.S. international tax professionals now that the U.S. tax position is actually more attractive. We even started to see at the end of 2018, these companies, they were looking to hire tax people with U.S. international tax backgrounds to be a part of their global teams that sit outside of the U.S. And for the long term, I believe it's really too early to predict because we just don't know what changes are going to be made yet. Adam, Tony, do you have any added comments that you would add to that?
Tony, you want to go first?
I appreciate that, Adam. So this is Tony. The real thing, I think, is what Peggy said at the end, and I think we all know this, the fluidity of the current tax code as to what will be here now versus years 2 or 3 with everything going on politically and such. So I think it's pretty much we know we have to deal with what we have. We don't know what we're going to have to deal with. And, I think inevitably there's a little bit of nervousness for the long-term horizon as to international tax planning needs and demands based upon what's available to do in the future. But in the short run, we clearly still have the issues, and a lot of them revolve around demand in the supply chain and transfer pricing areas. So I think those are the areas that you're going to continue to need support and help. There's also a couple of wild cards that we'll talk about later. The EU mandatory disclosure issues going on in the EU might actually require us to do more work in-house and not use outside advisors as much due to the disclosure requirements that are being put on these public accounting firms and the law firms for that matter. So it's a little bit of a thing. We have to keep an eye on that one and see how that develops, but it could increase the demand for talent. All of these other things that we're going to speak about later will also speak to this, the spin-offs, the carve-outs of these companies. We're creating more tax departments rather than consolidating them, which of course increases the headcount, usually by about 50%. Company with 100 tax people spins off, it usually creates about 150 jobs minimum in totality. So we have to find where those people are coming from. And we won't get into the supply side, but it's an issue for everybody, both in public accounting and professional services and in-house. Adam, anything you want to add to that?
No, I was actually, I have the EU directive section on my side of the fence. I'm going to cover that here in a minute, but I was going to speak to that precisely what you said, is I do think that, depending upon how things shake out with that, it could have an impact. So I think both in the short term and for the foreseeable future, there's no reason for anybody that's an international tax person to feel like international tax is going away or anything like that because of tax reform.
Absolutely.
I did get a question. It's not necessarily tax reform related, but Tom chatted it in, and I want to go ahead and at least get it out there on the table while we have time. It says, those of us on the call that are former GE tax, what are you hearing with the PwC migration? Is GE starting to notice the loss of knowledge and starting to feel the pain? As it's been 4 years in April, I'm curious of any of anything out there that's being said about that. I don't know, Tony, if you've heard anything on the GE side and any pain that they're feeling because of the outsourcing. I know that's been a big topic. It's not necessarily tax reform related, but I thought it was an interesting question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's as we've put out that paper we did on outsourcing. I think we made it very clear we've seen this before. It's not new. We did this in the late 80s and early 90s with Arthur Andersen leading the way with its same two focuses, which was tax reform disruption caused by the 86 Act, and then technology with their big group that they had down in Sarasota pitching that application to it. It didn't work then, and I don't see it working now, to be honest with you. Now, co-sourcing is different, but a complete outsourcing scenario, just not very feasible, and I don't see it working. I don't hear it's working really well. Candidates that have moved over with PwC, the majority of them that are reaching out to us are clearly not happy. In all fairness to GE, nobody expected the company to crumble as much as it has financially, so this is a little bit of a hard thing to answer because I don't know if GE's worried about their tax situation as they're selling things off and basically just trying to carve back to something that's sustainable as an ongoing entity going forward. I think if you're the CEO over there and you've got that on your plate, your tax position and what's going on there is way down the list in their minds right now. But from the tax professionals' point of view, I don't think they're happy that went over to PwC. And I don't really believe PwC is either because they're not getting nearly the hours they thought they were going to get on the consultative side because of what's going on with GE's business model right now. So they're having to ask these people to do other work where originally they told them they can convert over and spend 80-90% of their time on GE work. They're lucky if they spend 50% of their time in a lot of cases. And then they're having to be on the road traveling and they're back to selling. All the reasons they left before are now coming back to roost for a lot of them, not all of them, but we're seeing a large majority. We've probably, been involved with 3 or 4 very senior level people leaving and going into other corporate in-house roles and getting out of that outsourced model.
We do have another question that's come in on the, and again, kind of getting to what we talked about before. Do we see any opportunities for anyone who has experience other than U.S. tax? So I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, we have started to see people that have a non-U.S. background. Our partner with BPA has come to us asking for people in the U.S. that might be open to move. We'll go into some more non-U.S. oriented demand and things like that whenever we talk about the non-U.S. specifically. We're focusing on the U.S. side of the fence on this webinar, but I can just say to the person that asked that question, I think it was Luli, that we are seeing some demand for some outside the U.S. for people to have a U.S. background. Just one quick reminder, if you are, go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to say, if the questions, are we looking at seeing a big pickup of non-U.S. people based here in the U.S.? I don't think we've seen that trend. At least I haven't, Adam. Have you, as far as putting non-U.S. people here in the U.S. as opposed to U.S. people moving offshore there? I think the demand for people globally is there. Our BPA group is very busy right now. But non-U.S. people being based in the U.S., we just haven't seen that pattern pick up yet at all.
Okay, we're going to transition to the next section, which is actually a section that I'm going to cover, and it is dealing with the deconsolidation, spinoff, and M&A. In this section of the Global Tax Market Assessment, we discuss the various types of transactional activities that have been taking place. It's a multi-year trend that we've been seeing with a very large uptick in M&A, as well as spinoffs, and then what we're calling kind of deconsolidation. 2018 was an incredibly busy year overall from a transactional perspective. We've already seen evidence as within the first quarter of 2019 and some major acquisitions that are announced that it looks like we're certainly going to be on that same path. I happened to see an article on LinkedIn talking about the level of M&A activity that was going to be on par with 2018 and 2019. So I think we're all expecting it to be a very busy year. We are keeping an eye on some of these large companies like the Honeywells and United Technologies and Dow DuPont and how they're merging together and then deconsolidating and spinning off businesses and things like that, as this all has a chance to have a very large impact on the staffing needs for corporations, which also will then put pressure on the retention programs that various companies have in place and things like that. So all of this transactional activity is just another factor, like tax reform, like the demographics that Stephanie is going to be talking about here in just a minute, that are all contributing to a very active job market here for 2019. And with that, we'll go ahead and open up this, any questions that anyone has on the transactional side of the fence. One question I had come in, do you see, have you heard of any companies that are doing spinoffs deciding to outsource their departments versus building another department from scratch? I'll go ahead and, I mean, from my perspective, and Stephanie, I'd like for you to chime in here with what you're hearing. I haven't really heard of any company doing any kind of spinoff transaction that's deciding to do a GE style outsource of their entire department. I would not be surprised if companies didn't decide to incorporate some kind of co-sourcing situation, like Tony talked about before, especially early on in a spinoff situation when they may not have staffed up ahead of time and they're trying to kind of fill the gaps until the team's built. Have you heard of any companies doing anything similar?
I haven't actually. As far as full outsourcing like GE, no. But yeah, I agree. Co-sourcing is becoming more and more popular, and definitely in the interim until they get everybody staffed up, co-sourcing is a really good solution. So that's happening more and more.
Yeah, Adam, I'm just going to add to that. Yeah, I do. The perspective I have is that while it hasn't happened yet, it is being approached almost every single time by these advisors. So you have these public accounting firms, once they hear there's going to be any kind of deconsolidation, spinoffs, or acquisitions, they're coming in rapidly to present their options to the leadership, to the financial leadership. When we did the outsourcing article, one of the companies you mentioned, UTC, was going through that process, and the head of tax there, I know, had presented that to the CFO and in a timely manner, because there was a number of the public accounting firms talking about what they could do to take over tax functions post spinoffs. Obviously, a very dangerous time to even think about doing it. You're always at a risk for a material weakness on a spinoff. Anybody who's been through them knows that. You have to be very careful. To do it and outsource at the same time would be, I think, pushing the envelope way too far. But I promise you, they're having to sell these things aggressively, and they're doing it quite a bit. So insulate yourselves. If you're involved in a company and you're in leadership, make sure the financial management's been educated properly about the risks to even entertaining the idea of doing something that hasn't worked in the past and is not effectively being done now either. I don't see any huge success stories from any of these ones that have gone out there. The consulting fees go through the roof, and that's what happens at the end of the day. We can talk about that later on a different session, but nope, I think this is one not being shown out there a lot, but behind the scenes is being done a lot, so be careful about it.
Mm-hmm.
I just had an interesting question come in. It says, what advice do you have to a candidate considering a position at a company that's bringing their tax work back in-house? And they put from PwC, but I'd open it up, if it matters, to any of the big four firms that have it outsourced and are bringing it back in. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I mean, one of the things, I guess, oh, go ahead, Tony.
No, I was just going to say, from my perspective, what I always try to counsel with these candidates getting put into that situation and talking to management about when they rebuild a tax function, because the question, if I'm reading it right, Adam, is it was outsourced and now they're going to bring it all back in-house. Is that correct? And this person might be part of that?
Yeah, or they're considering considering a position at a company that's bringing their tax work back in-house.
Yeah, so I always tell people to first remember why they did what they did. Why did they outsource it first? Was it strictly to reduce costs? Was it to, deal with a disruptive period of time in the company's situation or generically in the market? Was it to increase their technology platforms? I want to know the reasons why they did it. And then that lends itself to figuring out what kind of department they want post. What are the metrics? What is the success performance metrics going to be with this new in-house tax department? I'm always nervous when it's always about reducing cost, and then they're going to build an in-house tax department, and then I want to know what the budget looks like and what the resources will be. But it can be a tremendously positive situation. It depends what their experiences have been. Have they had, so-so experience, not happy with what went on, and they realized that that was a mistake, and now they're going to go do it the right way, and they're going to give you the proper resources and budget to do it. it can be a tremendous opportunity to catch them at that time. But it might not be once you get under the hood and figure out why they did what they did, and then what are the new metrics and measurements going to be. That would be my advice. Go into that into some detail before you sign on the dotted line.
Yep, I think that's great. Looking to see if there's any additional questions on the transactional activity. I'm not seeing any. I do have some general questions that we'll get to at the end if we have time, but just keep things moving along. I'm going to transition things over to Stephanie Gilmartin, who is one of the directors of executive search, and she's going to handle the aging in-house tax population. Stephanie, go right ahead.
Thanks, Adam. So some of you may have experienced some of this already in your department. Some of you aren't, but we definitely want to make you aware of kind of what's going on. Right now, we are experiencing a shrinking pool of aging in-house tax executives. And this is due to a massive kind of wave of retirements, and it's creating really a crisis. And we expect that to kind of continue over the next couple of years. The reason why this is happening, and this is really important. So approximately 64% of the current heads of tax right now are ages 55 and older. You compound that with 52% of other senior level tax professionals, presumably the ones that are in line to step into those lead roles are 55 years of age or older as well. So in 2018, we started to see some of this. We expect that these retirements are going to continue this year, probably through the next 5 years. When really potentially more than a third of the current heads of tax will retire or leave their positions, excuse me, coupled with the bigger dilemma as those number twos kind of move up and do the same thing or are nearing retirement. So due to this talent drain, there's going to be a high demand of tax professionals that are willing and able to step into these lead roles. So one of the things that you guys need to do now is really start to look at this and put a plan in place so that you have a smooth transition if this happens to your department. So number one, put some succession planning in place. It's really critical to identify talent within your tax department. And you know, they're going to be, these top talent folks are going to be hard to hold on to, as you can see, with lots of opportunities opening up across the country. So you need to do everything you can to hold on to these people. Number one, put a succession plan in place. Make sure their compensation is at the right level. You're doing what they, you know, want to do in their career. You're really working with them to get the mentoring and the development they need. Second, another option that we're seeing is really popular is trying to keep the baby boomers that you have in place that might be looking to retire on staff in a contract, just in time kind of labor pool source. Their maturity, their technical expertise, their experience with the company is really invaluable. So if you can keep those people around or hire baby boomers that are in the market to step in and help you on a contract basis, that will help that transition. It'll mentor people underneath that'll be moving into those roles. So those are a couple of tips to really kind of help you hopefully have a smooth transition if you're facing this. Adam, I don't know if you've had any questions come in that quickly.
Yes, I have had a question come in actually from Kelly Lawler. So Kelly, you had your hand raised. I don't know if I'll open the floor if you want to ask Stephanie your question.
Sure. Stephanie, what I was wondering is, what does a true succession plan involve so that we can ensure that we have the objectives and the parameters necessary that make our staff feel comfortable of their long-term plans with the organization?
Well, I think number one, you've got to get your CFO or whoever the tax department reports to in line. Make sure that they are on board with putting succession planning in place, as well as your HR department. Kind of the circle of influence, everybody has to be in line to do that. Once everyone is in agreement that you believe in putting in succession planning, then it's about really talking honestly about your time frame, what your plan is, or whoever else in your department, their plan is, who in your department is the top talent that you would identify to step into that position, and then really start to work on timelines and what that person has to do to get there. You know, you can do a variety of things. I know, Kelly, you did this recently where you did some training or an assessment of a candidate, and we'll be putting a plan in place for that person to really develop in the areas that he may need. So doing something like that and getting the buy-off from CFO, from your top management, HR, to be able to do that. Setting goals quarterly with that individual, you know, making sure that the right training is there. Those are just a few things you could do. Adam or Tony, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would add, I mean, you hit on one of the major components is the development aspect of a retention plan. You know, we talk about with our clients here quite a bit, 3 prongs of retention. And, you know, we've seen over the years, just time after time after time, if someone feels like they're developing towards an area that they have interest in, right? It's not necessarily always company driven. I need you to work in this area, but you're actually talking to your people about the things that they have interest in, and they're developing towards those things, along with, you know, some of the things that the company needs. That goes a great, that will help your retention tremendously. And, you know, we'll see people that are even underpaid in the market, but they feel like they're really growing in their career, stay in a job versus, you know, taking another high paying job that may not take them in a direction they want to go. So that's development is one of the primary prongs of retention. The second prong is compensation. You do have to keep up with compensation. People will only stay underpaid for so long. So, you know, getting accurate salary data from sources to make sure that you're keeping up to the market, and not necessarily having to do it with everybody, but on your key people, you know, those 20% of the people that are providing 80% of the value, making sure that those key people are up to market with compensation, and then you can adjust everybody else off of that. So compensation is kind of the second piece. And then, you know, work-life balance, to the extent that you can do things to help on that side of the fence with flexible working or anything like that. You know, those 3 pieces together kind of encompass a holistic retention program. You have the most control over the development. Sometimes budget and the work hours and things like that are things you have, you know, less control over, just given the constraints, which is why, you know, it's ironic that that one is first and it's the one you have the most control over. I don't know if there's anything else, Tony, you'd add to that, or anybody else on the panel.
I think from my perspective, if you're dealing with the demographics and succession planning from a combination, it's to keep in mind that you need to stay close to these more senior people. If you have senior people on your staff, we're seeing people expediting their retirement ages, moving them up, not back. Whereas 5 years ago, I would have said most people were extending them further out. But post, you know, regulatory pressures, post tax reform, staring at technology that's coming in the door and having to learn Alteryx and what's an RPA and everything else, I'm actually seeing a trend the other way. And my clients are getting caught off guard. They're thinking they've got 2 or 3 years and they end up having 6 months. So just stay close to that population, knowing there'll be a domino effect for the rest of your team. When it comes to generic succession planning, Kelly, I think it's all about communication. It's understanding that individual, the key person Adam talked about, the top 20%ers, understanding what their needs and wants are, and then looking at what you can do to help them get there realistically within your organization. And some of, you know, my clients, you know, we have examples where we have, I think in one of my clients, we have 12 Fortune CTO candidates at 12 Fortune 500 companies from one company that we hired in the first 20 people. But we built in there succession planning, both internal within the organization and then external out in the market, so that they would win-win either way. and we kept an A player for 5 or 6 years instead of a B player for 20 years. And we came out way ahead of the deal. And of course, it made it easier to recruit because they saw people had opportunity. So there's a lot of positives in the succession planning model. I go back to Steph's original point, though. She's absolutely correct. Absolutely need buy-in from HR and finance leadership, making sure they're all committed behind it.
Thank you.
We got about 1 minute left for this section, but there's a good question. We won't be able to get to all of it, Linda, but I do see both of them here. The question is, what is the job outlook for 60-plus-year-olds that are being let go from companies due to migration of workers to lower countries or outsourcing or things like that? Stephanie, you want to give a little bit of insight into what it might look like for the older baby boomers that are still wanting to work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that companies are having to be more creative and having to open their minds up to bringing people in to work on projects or work in a position for, 5 or 6 years. We've seen several companies utilize someone that's at 60 years old, and they come in, as we talked about, and mentor the person underneath them. That's becoming much more popular. The other side, as I mentioned, is a contract position. That's becoming very popular with people that are retiring, or if you've been let go, where you have the opportunity to come in and work on very interesting work and maybe do it for 3 months, a year, 6 months, take a couple of months off in between, and then work on another project. So that's a really popular option for anyone, later in their career.
I'll give you a tangible example. I'm currently going to be working on a VP tax search in Chicago for a gentleman who's retiring about 2 years earlier than management wanted, but he's still in his very late 60s, and they wanted to keep him even longer. And we're going to be looking for somebody who's more senior in their background. We don't care if they want to work 4 or 5 more years, like Stephanie talked about. It's fine. And we have a young group underneath that would not be bottlenecked by this hire, and actually would view it as a welcome opportunity to be mentored and developed. So I think you'll see some more of these, what I call bridging the gap type of hires out there, even on a permanent nature. And then Stephanie's absolutely correct. The contract staffing, the gig economy is going to be here to stay, and it's going to be another tool in everybody's tool chest, without a doubt.
Totally agree. Have some other good questions from this section. We'll try to get to them here at the end. We need to keep things moving along, unfortunately, due to time constraints. So tax technology is next. We're going to transition over to Natalie Santiago, who is a senior recruiter here at TaxSearch. Natalie?
Thanks, Adam. So in 2018, we were hoping to get more answers on what technologies would be implemented and working for corporate tax departments, but with tax reform and its ongoing changes and difficulties, technology has been somewhat put on hold for most departments, so we haven't yet gotten many of those answers. However, so far in 2019, we're already seeing companies start to look at technology more and looking at how they can improve their tax functions by utilizing different technology platforms. So we do see this issue as an ongoing trend over the next 3 to 5 years. But to be honest, it's probably not one of the biggest issues facing tax departments this year. However, if you are one of those departments that has put this on hold or are just starting to look at it, definitely take the time to do it. Don't get behind the 8 ball on this. And in regard to our expectations for technology in 2019, one of the major talking points we've seen is how public accounting firms are being the driving force behind technology implementation projects. So you will see them trying to morph into providing various technology platforms for different clients. But as we've seen, trying to maintain different business models under the same company can be very challenging. Think back to Arthur Andersen in the 90s, having to spin off their IT consulting practice, which is now Accenture. And you can apply this logic to other industries. Why didn't a major hotel chain or global property management company start Airbnb? Basically, if it was easy, all of these big companies would already be doing it. But this year, we will be keeping a close eye to see if any pure tech-focused companies will seize on this opportunity. So perhaps one of them will lead the way and position themselves to be the technology gurus for tax instead of one of the accounting firms trying to drive technology implementation. Adam, let's open the floor up to questions. We got any in?
Let me see, going through the list here. Yeah, how is this technology advancement going to affect staffing? I'm told I'm going to have to, am I going to have to add headcount to do this work? Or if we're leaning towards machine learning, does that mean I would actually have to reduce my headcount?
That's a good question. I would say probably for now, we have too many questions to really determine exactly what's going to happen with staffing. But I don't think technology advancement will reduce headcount. You're still going to need people to help build out these functions. And then once they are built, you can focus on more of the value add work instead. When new technology has been introduced in the past, did headcount reduce? Certainly it didn't. So we don't expect that to happen just yet.
Adam, I'm going to just jump in there. I think now it's absolutely correct in the short run. I think, in fact, it's going to increase headcount. We're getting searches now for technology people, or taxologists, they call them, with RPA experience. So, bringing Alteryx into the system, into the office. We're seeing people carve out designated roles for this. I'm working with one of my clients right now, Fortune 100, and they've never really had a dedicated person focused on it. They're actually going to transfer somebody internally, and we're going to backfill that other person's role. But they're probably late to the game getting into it. But we're going to see more and more of these jobs in the short term come up and actually increase headcount. Longer term, I do think we will see some impact on headcount, without a doubt, especially in the indirect tax areas. I think the RPAs have a huge opportunity here to be implemented. It won't be as easy as everybody says it is, or the Big Four are predicting. But I do think in the long term we'll be able to actually decrease headcount in some of those areas. But Natalie's point is absolutely correct. I think some of this will be picked up by added headcount internally on the value add side, coming in and using some of the more higher level skill sets, both not only technically but also from a problem-solving people management standpoint, going in and working with the cross-functional groups and the business units more directly. I think there's going to be an evolution in that area, and we'll be beefing up headcount there.
Yeah, I can speak to that too, Tony. I have seen, I've got one client now I'm doing a high-level indirect tax search position for, and that job is open because the person who was in that role has moved internally to lead an internal tax technology team. And we're doing the backfill. And then the ultimate goal is for them to implement some kind of machine learning that can help on the compliance side of the fence, which won't affect the internal team because all of that work is outsourced to one, I think it was Deshar McMillan or Ryan or one of those big outsourcing groups in the indirect tax area. So the work will be taken from those guys, and we're actually going to add another headcount at the manager level under the lead person I'm hiring to kind of help manage both the technology and the transition of that work back in from the outsourced provider. So I think you're spot on there. Let's see. I got a question here. Are bots cost effective for routine tax processes? Tony, what do you think about that question in terms of bots and routine processes?
The jury's still out. I mean, if you're buying it from a public accounting firm, they're charging you to build it, customize it to your platform, and then they're usually charging you a licensing fee to use it on an ongoing basis, like the razor blade versus selling you the razor and then the razor blades. It will be interesting to see, that model. I do think in-house, if you want to build your team internally, which is a lot of my clients, I'm actually sending them information on some of the training platforms now for RPA. We have two organizations that do that, and trying to get these people to focus on developing tax programs specifically to help internally retrain these people in some areas like indirect tax. Take a great sales and use person or property tax person and get them, if they're technology oriented, up to speed on using some of the languages like Blue Prism and some of the others that are there, or getting them to be the expert on Alteryx and help move that internally in the group and get everybody trained up on it. So I'm not sure yet, and I haven't heard anything from my clients where they're like, wow, this is a no-brainer, or everybody's trying it and trying to figure it out. And I think that's maybe a better question for next year to answer. We'll have more data at that point.
Yeah, getting some of the same questions. Just to reiterate, I got one here. Is there any area of tax that can benefit more than others by use of RPA or other tax technology? I think we're still a little early on that, but clearly the indirect tax area is one that's being affected. I think we just talked about that a little bit. How do you best balance outsourcing or tax technology and tax controls represented to your audit firms? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You outsource the technology, and then who owns responsibility for the controls, right? Yeah, there's a ton of questions that this is going to bring to the surface, and who owns what, who's liable for what, right? At the end of the day, it's going to pose a lot of questions between this. If the technology blows up and doesn't work, who's responsible for it? Right? If you're doing it all in-house, it's yours, you own it, you're working with your own IT group, no different than any other internal platform. But if it's a vendor, public accounting firm, and, do we get in an argument about it was a user issue or it was a technology issue, or wasn't a technology issue because the user didn't update the data effectively? Again, a year from now, I expect to have more answers for you guys. Right now, I think some of those friction points haven't come up to the surface yet. Because the usage hasn't been there, but they will. By next year, I think we'll have a lot of those questions and a lot of identification of where there could be risk factors not really spotted on the front end so much.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of who's doing what, let's go ahead and transition over to the EU mandatory disclosure, because that is there's definitely a little bit of that going on here. So. This is a section that I'll take on our side of the fence. So this is a very new area that kind of like tax technology, but I think we're even a little bit ahead of the game in terms of talking about this with you guys, even more so than technology. And we want to make sure it's at least on your radar. This is a directive that was passed by the EU. It's still in the very early stages of implementation, and it basically states that if tax planning is handled in the EU by an intermediary of some sort. So think of a law firm or consulting, Big Four consulting firm or something like that, that the company or intermediary must adhere to some sort of disclosure rules. And those rules are really yet to be determined by each individual country. So each individual EU country is going to pass a set of laws that will govern a voluntary disclosure of any, potential tax planning initiative that is being undertaken in that country. So the specifics of the disclosure laws and also the ramifications, because a lot of these laws haven't been passed in all of the countries, there's a 2020 deadline for when these laws have to be in place in each country. So we don't really fully know exactly what the impact's going to be, but there is some very specific or some very potential significant ramifications, especially if there is, client privilege erosion that starts to take place depending upon how much these intermediaries have to report. There's also an issue of, if you have multiple intermediaries working on a project, who's reporting what and what message is being who's coordinating the message that is being sent to that particular country. And if it's a multi-country planning project, is the same message being sent to all the different countries based on the different rules? There's a whole slew of Pandora's box types of questions that are going to kind of come from this. We think that this flew under the radar as the EU, kind of passed this directive last year, and with tax reform happening here in the U.S., the Wayfair decision, just all of the other things happening in our country, we really don't, the tax professionals we've been talking to haven't really been up to speed on this directive. So we want to make sure that it's on the radar for tax leaders here in the U.S. and to kind of keep an eye on it going forward. So that's a little bit about the EU mandatory disclosure. And we will go ahead and kind of open up questions if anybody has any around that. And Tony, I don't know if you have anything to add on top of what I just described in terms of the disclosure on your side of the fence before we get to questions.
No, this was brought to my attention by a client, and I've talked to probably 10 additional clients of very sizable companies, and it's amazing how few have really grasped this issue. The few who have are really wrestling with the implications of this, and one of them I know is going to be adding very senior international global planning person to the team, which was not expected before because they fully expect to do less work with their outside advisor. They're going to do more in-house because of this. They see a lot of risk here in the disclosure. The advisors are coming in and actually asking them to pay to build a disclosure system to make sure that they properly disclose everything they need to do, but they're asking the client to pay to put it all together so that they can disclose on the client. So it's almost like ludicrous when you think about it, and then each country is different. Poland passed theirs. Germany's got theirs up. Poland actually added the VAT and direct tax areas to the recommendations from the EU, so they expanded it. Our fear factor is each member country is going to want to expand it. And at the end of the day, the one who's expanded it the most will be the litmus test for everybody else, which will be very burdensome on U.S. companies or global companies doing work in the EU. So keep an eye on it. I do think it has a potential. The reason we're bringing it up, we've been told and we see the pattern that it could impact staffing demand in that area for in-house people, causing even another layer of increased recruitment in the area. So we'll keep a close eye on it.
Yeah, I just had a question come in. Could companies just decide not to farm out their tax planning work to advisors? And I think the answer to that is sure they could. And it's one of. Oh, go ahead.
No, I think that's right. And if they are going to farm it out, they're going to farm out bits and pieces of it, not the holistic the strategy behind it, because then that's going to be required to be disclosed. So maybe you're going to chop it up a little bit and isolate the specific areas you need help in, and not bring the advisor into the big picture global strategic planning. My client here, that's what they're looking for, another big picture global strategic planning type of person to take that role on and then they'll still utilize the advisors, but only on a as needed basis in a segmented area.
Yeah. We did have a question come in from James. What are some of the leading technology solutions to the EU Voluntary Disclosure Directive? I think we're way too early to kind of know who's going to take the lead on any kind of technology. I think certainly the accounting firms will try to look at how they can build some kind of reporting mechanism or something like that. The more and more countries start to pass their laws and everybody kind of knows exactly what the disclosure laws are going to be, inevitably there's probably going to be some technology play in here that may try to help ease some of that.
Yeah, it's a conflict of interest scenario. We're the advisor. We're going to have to disclose on you, and we're going to control the software platform that you're going to use. I don't think that's the right answer, but that's what they're selling right now. And I think that would open up a huge can of worms to have them have access to all that information, especially if you're going to use it as a centralized resource for 3 law firms, 2 public accounting firms, all working on a major project, and they're going to control that platform. I absolutely think in the long run you're going to have to develop that and own it yourself. Each company, it's not going to be a third-party software solution. I just can't see the logic in that. The risk mitigation would be too high.
We've got a couple more minutes here before we wrap things up. There are some more general questions for the panel that I want to get to that we didn't get to. So a good one here. Are you seeing an increased demand for consultants throughout the U.S.? Are there particular locations that have the biggest needs? I would say overall, yes, we are seeing an increased demand for consultants on, kind of across the board. We have a whole division of our company that when I first started at the firm, 18 years ago, didn't even exist. And we do nothing in that division but help companies find independent contractors. So, and it's only going to increase and grow more. To say that there's a location of the country that has the biggest need, I mean, we have projects all across the country. Tony, you have any thoughts on locations for consultants?
Yeah, from a numbers standpoint, the bigger cities, whether it's a Chicago Metro, New York City Metro, right, Houston, those sort of markets tend to have more critical mass. But the irony of it is we're seeing a lot of our bigger companies in smaller towns realize that bringing talent in is so hard for them to do that this is a really an intricate way to do that. You know, we got a client up. You have a client up in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, that has a hard time getting good quality people. So it's one of their tools they add in the tool chest. We've done work for Disney out in Orlando. Orlando's a small tax market, so it's hard to find people. So bringing them in on a contract basis to help out and arms and legs is always there. So I think it works very well in the bigger condensed major urban areas, but we're seeing a huge demand also on the smaller town situations where people are having a hard time finding good people on a project basis. And all of these demands for supply and demand that we're talking about put huge pressure. If you haven't seen it yet, you will absolutely start to see the prices go up in the public accounting firms. I've gotten in Chicago, one public accounting firm raising their rates by 30%. I just talked to another client out in the New York region there, and again, 25-30% increase in rates. They're all short people. They can't find people to go work for them. So we're going to see that as pressures, and therefore the alternative to that is to bring in some of these people on through the gig economy. And we've done everything from interim VPs of tax to major post-integration work to transfer pricing, you name it, not just compliance and reporting, although, of course, we do that. But I think it's across the board we're going to see it. And technology, I should add, might add as well, that we see that, as well as provision and so on, like we talked about.
Got a number of other kind of general questions, but one here on the outsourcing. I know we talked about kind of the outsourcing trend. It says some large companies such as Duke Energy have outsourced their entire tax department to E&Y, and others like Bank of America have outsourced non-U.S. work to E&Y. Do you see other large companies continuing this trend, and what will it take for the pendulum to swing back to performing the work in-house? Stephanie, Tony, either of you want to take a stab?
Stephanie, you want to stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, Tony, that was the white paper that you just put out. I mean, Tony, I'm going to let you talk on that because it's probably right at the top of your tongue.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is some negative pressure come back, as it already starting to from the GE model. It didn't work as well as everybody hoped, either side. Duke Energy, over time we'll find out how that works. But generally speaking, as the outsourcing paper I said comes out there, the talented people in the group, if they wanted to go to work for Ernst & Young, they would have went to work for Ernst & Young, and Ernst & Young would have hired them in a minute. It will take a little bit of time for people to realize that, they're kind of part of the company and they're not part of the company. Once they lose some of those legacy people and they have to go back to using people just like they would if they were hiring a public accounting firm from the inside, and it's not their old employees still on the payroll, that's going to be the tipping point. If you think about what we're saying to you, this is going to be very much a candidate-driven market. High demand, low supply. For all the reasons we've talked about, the demographics, tax reform, consolidations, spin-offs, everything here. If you understand that, then these people are going to get opportunities to go somewhere else and be happier than working back in a public accounting firm with all of those pressures on hours, billable hours, and all the things that come with it. You're a commodity more than an actual person they're building on and developing, right? At the end of the day, especially in those groups, you're not on a track to make partner, right? You're just a glorified, staff person to get work done and make money for the firm. So it falls apart on its own over time, and I wouldn't worry about it. I don't see this being some mega trend. And again, got to remember, there was a lot of companies that were told in the press that tax was going to get simpler, things were going to get easier. It's going to not be such a big deal, right? And then tax reform hits, and it's this commingled nonsense that we've got here to wrestle with. So all of this is going to flush out, but I don't think you have to worry about that being a major trend. And I think if you're recruiting and you need staff, I would go and find and talk to people at those companies. Those companies that are being outsourced, those people are highly likely to be motivated to come to work for you in your in-house role. So use them as a target. And as they start to lose those people, it has a self-prophecy of eroding itself because the knowledge is gone. The internal knowledge walks out the door. You can't get it back.
Tony, I think we are at the end of our time. You want to go ahead and wrap things up?
Sure. First, I want to thank everybody for taking the time. I know you're so busy with everything going on here, but this year I can't stress enough that retention, number one. Look at your top performers and make sure you hold on to them as best you can. Think about sitting down and understanding what their needs and wants are and trying to do a development plan with each of them. It's worth your time. Trust me. This is a recruiting firm telling you you can't recruit happy people. I promise you, you can't. And they don't have to be paid the most. They just can't be at the bottom quartile of the pay scale. So make sure you get good data on that as well. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be a rewarding year too, though. We're going to make a lot of progress this year, and we are going to get our head around technology. We're going to get our head around tax reform. We're going to start to understand how to get in front of, as Stephanie pointed out, the demographic issues that are coming on. Natalie's pointed out about the technology opportunities that are there. It's going to be an exciting year. You're going to feel stressed. You need to dialogue with financial leadership and HR leadership. They need to understand what's going on. You know, if any of you didn't get the demographic paper or the outsourcing paper, please just send us a note. We'll send it over to you. Many of my clients have seen it up the ladder. HR have seen them. The finance CFOs have seen these documents. It softens them up to understand. I had one client, a major pharmaceutical company. True story. I sent them the issue on outsourcing, and the head of tax got a call from the CFO and said, "Are you available this Thursday for dinner?" And sure enough, one of the big four audit partners and tax partners was taking out the CFO, and the CFO just saw that the topic, one of the major topics, was going to be potential outsourcing of the tax function. They did not do this through the head of tax. They went around the head of tax. So, you know, luckily he had sent that paper to that CFO, and the CFO said, "It'd be very interesting to see them when you walk in and you're at the dinner with them." And he did just that. And then he and the tax partner had a heart-to-heart talk the next day after dinner. So, again, you've got to dialogue this to your leadership team, and HR needs to be included. They need to understand some of the pressures you guys are going to be under, and that tax is not finance. Every job in finance is not the same, and tax is not the same as accounting jobs and finance jobs, and both from supply and demand perspectives. So I stress to you, take this information and use it intelligently. Make sure you've got the proper resources that are in alignment with the KPI and the metrics that they're asking you to achieve. This is going to be a challenging time, and I still have some CFOs asking for major drops in ETR rates, and I kind of chuckle at them and go, how is that going to happen in this climate right now with what we know that's going on? You know, you have to come up to speed with what's going on. And the head of tax had not really spent a lot of time with the CFO doing that. So we gave him a crash course, and I think he's a little more realistic about what to put in front of the board from an expectation standpoint. And I think the tax leader is pretty happy that we added a little bit of input from a broader market perspective. But you've got to do that as best you can going forward here. Each of these people that presented will be available. If you have any questions to follow up on, feel free to reach out to them directly. And anything we can do indirectly or directly, please let us know. We are putting out, just so everybody knows, our tax hiring survey. It is the only survey in the profession for corporate in-house tax departments. We've done that for, I think, over a decade. We will have that information being put out to be filled in from your chief tax officers over the next probably 2 to 3 weeks. And then we'll compile it, and we hope to get that out to you by the first or second week of April, which will be great information for you guys to, again, use to help educate HR and your financial leadership team as well. So once again, I appreciate everybody taking the time. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, each of the tax search members who put on the presentations here, and everyone have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.